My brother claimed my estate for his newborn. Now he is taking me to court while my parents fund his lawsuit. Watch how I completely ruined their master plan. And I am 32 years old, and if you were to ask me what the defining characteristic of my adult life has been so far, I would not say it was my career, my relationships, or my hobbies. I would tell you that my life has been defined by the smell of sawdust, the sharp sting of blistered hands, and the relentless, exhausting process of bringing a dead thing back to life. You see, I own a 19th century estate. I know exactly how that word sounds to most people. The word estate usually conjures up images of spoiled trust fund kids, inherited generational wealth, and people who have never had to do a single day of hard labor in their entire existence. But that is absolutely not my story. When my grandparents passed away, they did leave this massive property to me, but it was not a gift of luxury. It was a curse that no one else in the bloodline wanted. They left it to me not because I was the favorite grandson, but because I was the only person in the family foolish enough, or perhaps desperate enough, to take it on. When the deed was finally transferred into my name 5 years ago, the house was nothing more than a rotting carcass of wood and stone. It had been abandoned for the better part of a decade. The roof was practically caving in, allowing rainwater to soak into the upper floors. The plumbing was a complete disaster waiting to happen. The electrical wiring was a massive fire hazard from the 1950s, and the foundation was slowly crumbling back into the damp earth. My family, including my older brother, Declan, and my parents, took exactly one look at the repair estimates from the contractors and laughed right in my face. They told me I was out of my mind. They told me to sell the land for scrap, to take whatever meager cash the property was worth, and to walk away before it completely bankrupted me. But I did not walk away. I could not explain it to them at the time, but walking away felt like giving up on myself. For 5 long, grueling years, I poured every single dollar I earned into this place. I worked double shifts at my corporate job, staring at spreadsheets until my eyes burned, only to come home at midnight, put on a heavy tool belt, and tear up decaying floorboards until 3 in the morning. I ate cheap instant noodles and canned beans for months on end just to afford the materials for the new copper plumbing. I did not take vacations. I did not go out to bars with friends. I did not date. I sacrificed the best years of my 20s to breathe life back into these walls. I learned how to lay drywall by watching internet videos at 2 in the morning. I froze in the winter when the heating was broken, and I sweated through my clothes in the summer while fixing the roof. This house is not just a building to me. It is a physical manifestation of my independence and my personal resilience. It is my emotional fortress. Every single nail I drove into the wood, every single wall I painted, it was my way of building a life completely separate from the chaotic, toxic dynamic of my family. I had spent my entire childhood playing the role of the invisible child. I was the one who was expected to quietly take care of himself, to never ask for help, and to never cause a problem so that all the attention, all the money, and all the emotional resources could be funneled directly to my older brother. Fixing this broken house was my way of fixing my own broken history. It was the one thing in the entire world that was entirely mine, earned through my own blood, sweat, and absolute physical exhaustion. It was my sanctuary. And then, on a completely random Tuesday afternoon, the peaceful illusion of my newly rebuilt life was shattered. I had just finished painting the trim in the front hallway. I was standing back, admiring the smooth finish, feeling a rare moment of genuine pride. The house was quiet, safe, and secure. Then a heavy, aggressive knock pounded against my newly restored front door, echoing loudly through the hallway and signaling the end of my piece. I wiped the wet paint off my hands with an old, stained rag and walked toward the entryway, fully expecting to see a delivery driver dropping off a package, or perhaps one of my neighbors coming to ask a question about the property line. I reached out, unlocked the heavy oak door, and pulled it open, a polite smile already forming on my face. But the smile vanished the absolute second my eyes adjusted to the sunlight. Standing on my front porch was my older brother, Declan. He is 35 years old, though he has lived his entire adult life with the emotional maturity and entitlement of a spoiled teenager. In his left arm, he was holding his newborn baby, awkwardly supporting the child against his chest. In his right hand, he clutched a thick, heavy manila folder. There was no warm, brotherly greeting. There was no smile, no asking how I was doing, no polite small talk about the weather or how the renovations were coming along. Declan looked at me with a cold, hard, almost clinical expression. It was the exact kind of look a debt collector gives you when your time is up and they have come to collect what is rightfully theirs. Before I could even manage to say hello or ask why he was showing up unannounced, he stepped forward. He crossed the invisible boundary of my personal space, looming over the threshold, and started speaking in a tone that made the blood run absolutely cold in my veins. He did not ask me for a favor. He demanded compliance. He looked me dead in the eye and told me that since I was single, since I had no wife and no children to take care of, I had an unnecessary and selfish surplus of living space. He pointed a finger toward the hallway, noting that the estate had 6 bedrooms, multiple living areas, and 3 acres of land. He stated, as if he were reading from a legal statute, that this much space was completely useless for a man living all by himself. Then, with the casual, breathtaking arrogance of someone who truly believes the universe revolves entirely around his needs, he stated that he and his wife were suffocating in their cramped 2-bedroom apartment. He went on to explain that they had a child now. They were a real family, unlike me. They had real needs, real responsibilities, and a real future to build. Therefore, he concluded, it was only logical, only right, and only fair that I sign the deed of the estate over to them immediately. For a few agonizing seconds, my brain completely stalled. I literally stopped processing information. I just stared at him, waiting for the punchline. I was waiting for him to crack a smile, to laugh, to slap me on the shoulder and tell me it was just a ridiculous, ill-conceived joke. But his features remained set in stone. He was dead serious. As I listened to him talk, I realized the absolute depth of his emotional bankruptcy. He spoke about my home, the place I had bled for, as if it were simply unearned family inventory that he was claiming from a storage unit. He completely, purposefully ignored the 5 years of grueling, back-breaking labor I had just put into the property. In his mind, the fact that I had financial stability and a nice house, while he had made a decade of poor financial choices, meant that he was automatically entitled to the fruits of my labor. He operated on a system of default priority. He believed that my success was not something I earned, but rather a surplus resource that belonged to him the moment he needed it. I stood there on the porch, listening to him lay out his warped economic theory of family wealth. He even had the nerve to suggest that by giving him the house, I would be doing the honorable thing, fulfilling my duty as an uncle and a brother. He spoke with such conviction, such unwavering belief in his own lies, that it was almost mesmerizing. He truly believed that my entire existence, my 5 years of suffering, my delayed gratification, and my hard-earned money were all just stepping stones designed by the universe to eventually provide him with a comfortable life. He was completely blind to his own greed, and as I looked at the thick manila folder in his hand, I realized this was not an impulsive visit. This was a highly calculated ambush. Before I could even formulate a complete sentence to respond to the sheer, mind-boggling audacity of his demand, a shadow moved from the edge of the driveway. Stepping out from behind the trunk of their parked car was Valerie, Declan's wife. She is 33 years old, but she carries herself with the frail, weaponized vulnerability of a Victorian maiden constantly in distress. She walked up the porch steps, perfectly timing her entrance like an actress stepping onto a brightly lit stage, and positioned herself slightly behind Declan. Right on cue, her eyes welled up with tears. She did not yell or act entitled like my brother. Instead, she began her performance, unleashing a trembling, highly manipulative monologue about how incredibly hard things had been for them lately. She talked about how the baby was not sleeping through the night, about the crushing anxiety of checking their bank account, and about how they were drowning under the weight of rising rent payments. She used powerful, loaded words like family duty, ultimate sacrifice, and the greater good. She looked at me with those wide, watery eyes, her voice cracking perfectly, and said that she knew, deep down in her heart, that I was a generous, loving person who would never let his own flesh-and-blood nephew grow up in a miserable, cramped little apartment while I lived alone in a mansion. It was a masterclass in emotional manipulation. If I had not spent my entire life watching people use guilt to control me, it might have actually worked. But then, she made her fatal mistake. Her mask of the desperate, helpless mother slipped just a fraction of an inch. She reached up, wiped a fake tear from her cheek, and casually mentioned that they had already planned out exactly how they were going to use the rooms in the estate. She told me they were going to knock down the beautiful plastered wall in the second parlor, the exact wall I had just spent 3 weeks painstakingly restoring by hand, to make a larger, open-concept playroom for the baby. She smiled then, a tight, cold, highly calculating little smile, and told me that as a single guy with a good income, I would easily be able to find a nice, quiet one-bedroom condo downtown. They were not standing on my porch asking for a massive favor. They were officially evicting me from my own life. They had already divided my spoils before the battle even began. I looked at Declan, whose chest was puffed out with unearned pride. I looked at Valerie, whose fake tears had completely dried the moment she started talking about interior design and knocking down my walls. I felt a cold, hard knot form in the dead center of my chest. I did not yell. I did not scream or argue. I did not waste a single breath trying to explain the hundreds of thousands of dollars and the thousands of hours I had invested into the very foundation we were currently standing on. I just looked them dead in the eyes, took a slow, deep breath, and said one single word. No. The shift in their demeanor was instantaneous and absolutely terrifying. Valerie's manufactured sadness vanished into thin air, replaced immediately by a glaring, hateful scowl that twisted her delicate features. Declan's face turned bright, splotchy red. He stepped forward, trying to use his physical size to intimidate me, and violently threw the thick manila folder onto my porch chair. The folder broke open, spilling white papers that, I later realized, contained a full, written-out transition plan for my eviction, complete with moving company quotes. He pointed a shaking finger directly in my face, his voice trembling with genuine rage, and told me that I was a selfish, pathetic loser who cared more about dead bricks and rotten wood than his own living family. He told me that I would deeply regret this decision. Then, without waiting for a response, he turned around, grabbed Valerie tightly by the arm, and they marched aggressively back to their car, slamming the doors and leaving me standing in the heavy silence of my doorway. I barely slept that night. I spent hours tossing and turning in my bed, staring up at the dark ceiling, plagued by the sick, sinking feeling that the brutal confrontation on my front porch was only the beginning of a much larger nightmare. I was right. At exactly 8 in the morning, right as I was pouring my first cup of coffee, my phone began to ring. I looked down at the bright screen resting on the kitchen counter. It was my parents. I took a deep breath, braced myself for the inevitable impact, and answered the call. Immediately, the psychological warfare began. My mother, Margaret, spoke first. She did not ask how I was doing. She did not ask for my side of the story or inquire why Declan had stormed off my property in a rage. Instead, she launched directly into a long, suffocating, pre-rehearsed lecture about the sacred meaning of family, heavily layering her words with thick, suffocating guilt and deep shame. She called me greedy. She told me that I had a cold, unforgiving heart, and that I was hoarding vast resources while my own brother struggled to keep his head above water. When I tried to interrupt, to defend myself and remind her that I had rebuilt this house with my own bare hands while they had all mocked me for buying a ruin, my father, Richard, forcefully took the phone from her. My father has always prided himself on being a man of cold, calculating logic, but his logic has always been deeply and intentionally flawed whenever it comes to his oldest son. He told me, in a very calm, dangerously rational voice, that I was financially resilient. He said that because I was successful and had no dependents, I could easily absorb the massive financial loss of the house, pack up my things, and start over somewhere else. Declan, on the other hand, was weak. My father actually used those exact words. He said Declan could not handle adversity, that the stress of a small apartment was destroying his marriage, and that he needed a stable environment magically provided for him. Therefore, my father concluded, it was my fundamental obligation as the stronger brother to act as the shock absorber for Declan's miserable life choices. Listening to his voice echoing through the speaker, a very specific, incredibly painful memory from my past clawed its way to the surface of my mind. I was 19 years old. I had worked 2 terrible, soul-crushing retail jobs for 3 straight years, saving every single penny to build a college fund. But Declan, who was 22 at the time, had managed to rack up a massive amount of high-interest credit card debt, living a reckless party lifestyle. My parents took my college savings, money I had literally bled for, and used it to wipe out Declan's debt overnight. They looked me in the eye and told me I was smart and capable, that I would easily figure out another way to pay for school, perhaps through student loans, but that Declan was fragile and needed a clean slate to succeed. That was the moment I realized my parents were completely drowning in the sunk cost fallacy of their own parenting. They had invested so much time, energy, and money into making sure Declan never had to face a single consequence for his actions, that forcing him to take responsibility now would mean admitting they had completely failed as parents. It was infinitely easier for them to sacrifice my future, my money, and now my home, just to keep the illusion of Declan's competence alive. I listened to my father breathing on the other end of the line, waiting for me to cave. I told him, my voice completely devoid of any emotion, that the Bank of Julian was permanently closed. I told him I would rather burn the house to the ground than hand the keys to Declan. I hung up the phone before he could reply, my hands shaking with a mixture of adrenaline and profound grief. By noon that same day, the private family dispute was violently dragged out into the public square. Valerie is a modern master of victim marketing, and she knows exactly how to manipulate a digital audience to do her dirty work. She took to Facebook and wrote a massive, multi-paragraph essay that belonged in a tragic novel. She was extremely careful. She did not use my name explicitly, but she painted a devastatingly effective and easily identifiable picture. She wrote extensively about the agonizing pain of a young, exhausted mother trying desperately to provide a safe, clean home for her newborn baby. She wrote about the profound heartbreak of realizing that family loyalty is just an illusion, and she detailed the outright cruelty of people who hoard wealth, massive properties, and empty bedrooms while their own blood relatives suffer in grinding poverty. She pressed all the right psychological buttons. She used all the correct cultural buzzwords. She positioned herself as the ultimate martyr, and the internet, which is always incredibly hungry for trauma and outrage, swallowed her story whole. Within a matter of hours, my phone was blowing up with notifications. It was not just my immediate family harassing me anymore. Aunt Martha, a woman I had not spoken to in 7 years because she once stole money from my grandmother, sent me a long, scathing text message calling me a disgusting disgrace to the family name. Distant cousins I had not seen since I was a child, old family friends, and people I barely remembered from high school began flooding my inbox with self-righteous anger. One cousin suggested I was mentally ill for wanting to live alone in a giant house. A family friend commented on Valerie's post offering to help them pay for moving trucks, completely assuming that I would eventually surrender the property. They accused me of being a heartless monster. They told me I should be deeply ashamed to show my face in public, and that karma would eventually take everything I loved away from me. I sat alone at my kitchen table, watching the endless stream of hateful notifications pile up on my glowing screen, feeling the digital guillotine dropping directly onto my neck. I was being tried, convicted, and executed by a jury of people who knew absolutely nothing about the truth, who did not know about the stolen college fund, and who had never swung a hammer in their lives. The anxiety was a heavy, physical weight pressing down on my chest, making it genuinely hard to breathe. I wanted to scream. I wanted to type out a massive response exposing everything, uploading photos of the rotting house I had bought and the receipts for the materials I had purchased. But I knew that engaging with them, trying to logically explain myself in a toxic comment section, would only feed the fire. It would only give them the drama and the validation they were desperately craving. So, I did the only thing I could do to protect my sanity. I picked up my smartphone, held down the power button until the screen went completely black, walked into my home office, and threw the device into the bottom drawer of my heavy wooden desk. I slammed the drawer shut, officially cutting off the noise and retreating into the physical reality of the house they were trying to steal. For the next several days, I lived in a state of total, unbroken isolation. I woke up, drove to work, did my corporate job in absolute silence, and drove straight back to the estate. I did not turn my phone back on. I spent my long, quiet evenings wandering through the large, empty rooms of my house. The silence, which had once been so comforting to me, was now completely deafening. Every single time I looked at the beautifully restored crown molding in the dining room or ran my hand over the polished oak floors in the hallway, I was violently reminded of the people who were actively conspiring to steal it all from me. The emotional toll of those few days was incredibly crushing. As I walked the halls, I realized, with a heavy, sickening, and absolute certainty, that my entire bloodline viewed me not as a human being, not as a son, and certainly not as a brother, but merely as a backup plan. I was nothing more than an emergency insurance policy, a human safety net that they expected to cash out whenever my older brother crashed his life into a wall. They did not love me, they simply loved the utility I provided. At first, this dark realization brought a deep, profound sadness that left me sitting on the floor of my living room, staring blankly at the wall for hours. But as the days slowly turned into a full week, as I sat alone inside the fortress I had built from the ruins, that paralyzing sadness began to harden. It calcified into something entirely different. The deep-seated guilt they had spent decades trying to plant in my head completely withered and died, replaced by a cold, highly calculated, and terrifying anger. They thought I was the exact same quiet, compliant kid who had let them steal his college money without putting up a single fight. They thought I would eventually break under the immense pressure of social isolation and cyberbullying. They assumed I would cave to the harassment, hand over the keys, and walk away just to buy back their fake love and approval. They were dead wrong. I looked around my sanctuary, at the walls that represented my blood, sweat, and tears, and I made a definitive decision that would alter the trajectory of my entire life. I was not going to be a victim ever again. I was not going to run away, and I was not going to hide in the shadows while they destroyed my reputation. If they wanted a brutal war over this estate, I was going to give them one, but I was going to fight it entirely on my terms, using rules they did not even know existed. The very next morning, I woke up early, put on my best suit, and drove directly into the heart of the city. I parked outside a towering, high-end corporate glass building. I walked confidently into the marble lobby, took the elevator to the 20th floor, and walked into the reception area of a man named Harrison. He was widely known as one of the most ruthless, expensive, and devastating real estate litigators in the entire state. The time for being the bigger person was officially over. It was time to systematically dismantle my family. Please make sure to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment down below with the name of the city you are living in. Every single comment helps push this video out to more people, and I really appreciate your support. I had officially put Harrison on a very hefty legal retainer, knowing deep down in my gut that my family was not going to let this situation go quietly. I had prepared myself for more cyberbullying, more angry text messages from distant relatives, and perhaps even another unannounced visit from my brother to scream at me on my front lawn. But even with my newly hired legal shield, and even with all my mental preparation, I was absolutely not fully prepared for what actually happened during the second week of my total isolation. It was a Tuesday. I pulled my car into my long gravel driveway after a particularly exhausting 10-hour day at the corporate office. The sun was just beginning to set, casting long, dark, stretching shadows across the front lawn that I had meticulously landscaped myself. As I walked up the wooden porch steps, The exact same steps I had sanded and rebuilt by hand just 2 summers ago. My eyes caught something completely out of place. Taped directly to the dead center of my heavy oak front door was a thick, pristine white envelope. There was no stamp. It had not come through the regular postal service. It had been delivered by a process server. My hands actually shook a little bit as I reached up, pulled the tape off the wood, and tore the heavy paper open. I stood there in the fading evening light, the cool wind brushing against the back of my neck, and pulled out a stack of legally bound papers. It was a formal notice of legal action. A civil summons. My older brother, Declan, and his wife, Valerie, were officially taking me to court. I stood there on my porch, reading the stiff, formal legal jargon printed on the crisp white pages, and I actually let out a short, incredibly bitter laugh. It was a sharp sound, completely devoid of any real humor. The sheer, unadulterated absurdity of the document I was holding in my hands was absolutely staggering. They were officially suing me for the deed to my own house. According to the paperwork drafted by their attorney, they were claiming something they loosely defined as ancestral rights, along with a completely fabricated claim regarding the unfair distribution of family wealth. They were legitimately trying to argue, in a real court of law, in front of a real judge, that because my grandparents had left this massive property solely to me, and because I was currently an unmarried man with no children, the legal system should forcefully intervene. They wanted a judge to legally redistribute my private property, my home, to them simply because they had managed to reproduce and I had not. They were arguing that my 5 years of grueling, back-breaking labor to restore the rotting house was completely irrelevant compared to their biological need for more space. I spent a very long time standing on that porch, staring at the black ink on the page, silently mocking the sheer insanity of a legal system that would even allow a clerk to file such a frivolous piece of absolute garbage. Even with my limited legal knowledge, I knew they had absolutely no legal leg to stand on. The last will and testament of my grandparents was completely ironclad. They had utilized a fantastic estate lawyer. Furthermore, I knew for a fact that my grandparents had specifically, intentionally excluded Declan from the will because of his long, documented history of reckless spending habits and credit card debt. But as I walked inside and locked the door behind me, a dark realization settled over my mind. Declan and Valerie did not care about the actual law. They did not care if their legal argument was fundamentally flawed. They cared about one thing, and one thing only: immense pressure. They deeply believed that the mere threat of a long, drawn-out, public, and incredibly expensive legal battle would terrify me into complete submission. They thought I would look at the massive legal fees required to properly defend myself against a civil lawsuit, sit down, do the math, and ultimately decide it was far cheaper and less stressful to just give them the house, or, at the very least, pay them a massive, six-figure cash settlement just to make them go away. It was not a lawsuit based on merit. It was legal extortion, plain and simple, wrapped up in a neat little white envelope. The very next morning, I took an emergency half-day off from my job. By 10 o'clock, I was sitting in a plush, incredibly comfortable leather chair in Harrison's downtown office, sliding the thick stack of legal documents across his massive, polished mahogany desk. Harrison did not look shocked. He did not gasp or express any outrage. He simply pushed his silver glasses up the bridge of his nose, picked up the paperwork, and scanned the pages in total silence for several minutes. When he finally looked up at me, his expression was perfectly, professionally neutral. He confirmed exactly what I had already figured out the night before. The lawsuit was completely frivolous. It was a legal intimidation tactic. However, as Harrison tapped his expensive fountain pen against the heavy paper, he pointed out something that made my stomach drop entirely into my shoes. He flipped the packet over to the very last page, tapped the signature block, and pointed at the name of the law firm currently representing my brother. Harrison leaned back in his chair and explained the brutal reality of the situation. He told me that this was not some cheap, desperate attorney working out of a suburban strip mall. This was a premier, highly aggressive downtown litigation firm known for bleeding their opponents completely dry through endless paperwork, constant delays, and ruthless legal tactics. He looked me dead in the eye and told me that this specific firm absolutely did not take family property dispute cases on a contingency basis. They required massive, upfront retainer fees just to open a file. I sat there in the quiet office, staring at the beautifully embossed logo on the legal paper, trying desperately to connect the dots in my mind. Declan had been unemployed for 6 months. Valerie worked 15 hours a week at a boutique clothing store. They had literally stood on my front porch just a week ago, crying real tears, claiming they were drowning in rent payments and could barely afford to buy groceries for their baby. There was absolutely no mathematical, logical way they could afford to write a check for a $50,000 legal retainer. And then, the horrible, suffocating, world-shattering truth hit me like a physical blow directly to the chest. The money had to come from the bank of Mom and Dad. My parents, Richard and Margaret, who were supposedly living on a very strict, fixed retirement income, had to have completely drained their savings accounts. The psychological devastation I felt in that exact moment had absolutely nothing to do with the lawsuit itself. I was not afraid of losing the house in court. I knew Harrison would destroy them. What broke me, what completely shattered the last remaining, microscopic fragment of my heart, was the realization that my own parents were actively, willingly funding a targeted attack against my life. They had taken the money they had saved for 30 years, the money they were supposed to use for their medical care and twilight years, the money I had actively worried about them not having enough of, and weaponized it to destroy my financial future. They were not just standing on the sidelines hoping Declan would win. They were the ones buying the bullets for his gun. They were paying $50,000 to a ruthless law firm to try and render their youngest son homeless, all to ensure that their golden child did not have to experience the mild inconvenience of living in a small apartment. The sheer scale of the betrayal was so massive, so completely incomprehensible, that I actually felt dizzy. I thanked Harrison, told him to proceed with the defense, and walked out of his office in a complete and total daze. I left the towering glass building, walked to the underground parking garage, and got into my car. I started the engine, but I did not drive back to the corporate office, and I did not drive back to the estate. I pulled out onto the highway and drove straight toward the quiet, manicured suburbs where my parents lived. It was a 45-minute drive, and for every single minute of that journey, I was trapped in a dark, suffocating prison of my own thoughts. The landscape rolling past my windows blurred into meaningless colors as my heart pounded violently against my ribs. I turned the radio off. The silence in the car was heavy. As I drove, my mind involuntarily began replaying a massive highlight reel of my entire childhood. I thought about every single holiday, every birthday, every forced family dinner where I had sat quietly in the corner while they praised Declan for simply waking up in the morning. I remembered when I was 16, asking for a used car so I could get to my after-school job, and being told money was incredibly tight. A month later, they bought Declan a brand new truck because he had wrecked his previous one. I realized, gripping the leather steering wheel until my knuckles turned completely white, that I had spent my entire life trying to earn the love and respect of people who were fundamentally, psychologically incapable of loving me. I was not a son to them. I was a utility. When I finally pulled into their pristine, perfectly paved driveway, I did not bother knocking on the front door. I used the old brass spare key they had given me years ago, pushed the heavy door open, and walked straight into their house. The familiar smell of potpourri and old carpets hit my nose, a smell that used to mean home, but now just made me feel sick. I walked directly into the living room. Richard and Margaret were sitting on the floral sofa, drinking tea and watching a daytime television program. They looked up, completely startled by my sudden, silent appearance. I did not yell. I did not throw anything or curse at them. I stood in the exact center of their living room, my hands shoved deep into my pockets to hide the fact that they were shaking, and I spoke with a terrifying, absolute clarity. I asked them, point blank, looking directly into my mother's eyes, exactly how much of their retirement savings they had wired to Declan's lawyers. My mother had the absolute audacity to look guilty for exactly 3 seconds. She looked down at her teacup, shifting uncomfortably, before her face hardened into that deeply familiar mask of self-righteous indignation. My father simply muted the television, crossed his arms over his chest, and looked at me with cold, unwavering defiance. They did not try to deny it. They did not try to lie. My father told me, in his perfectly measured, infuriatingly calm voice, that they were simply trying to balance the scales of the universe. He said that the world had been far too kind to me, that I had gotten lucky with my career and the house, while the world had been unnecessarily cruel to Declan. He looked his own flesh and blood in the eye and stated that as parents, it was their sacred job to level the playing field. They genuinely, truly believed that ruining my life, stealing my property, and putting me through the hell of a lawsuit was a beautiful act of parental love toward my brother. I looked at the two people who had brought me into this world, the people who had watched me bleed, sweat, and starve to build a secure life for myself, and I realized I felt absolutely nothing for them anymore. The deep well of my empathy was completely, permanently dry. I told them, my voice as cold as ice, that from this exact moment forward, they no longer had a second son. I pulled their spare key out of my pocket and dropped it onto the glass coffee table. The sharp, high-pitched clinking sound seemed to echo forever in the quiet room. I turned my back on them, walked out the front door, and mentally buried my parents. As far as I was concerned, I was now an orphan. 3 agonizing weeks passed. The lawsuit officially entered the discovery phase, which meant a massive mountain of paperwork was being exchanged between Harrison's office and the expensive firm my parents had hired. I spent my days working, and my nights sitting alone in the estate, trying to process the death of my family. I had successfully blocked every single relative's phone number. The silence was my only companion. Then, on a rainy Thursday afternoon, Harrison called my cell phone. His usually calm, incredibly composed voice was laced with an undeniable sense of absolute urgency. He did not want to speak over the phone. He told me to leave work and come to his office immediately. When I arrived 20 minutes later, Harrison was standing behind his desk. He had pushed all the other files aside. There was a single, solitary piece of paper isolated in the exact center of his mahogany desk. He told me that this document had been buried deep within the hundreds of pages of discovery documents submitted by Declan's legal team. They had tried to hide it in the middle of a stack of irrelevant bank statements, hoping Harrison would just skim past it. He turned the paper around so it faced me. It was titled, in bold black letters, Formal Family Shared Property Agreement. I picked up the paper, my eyes scanning the text. According to the legally binding language on this document, exactly 3 years ago, I had allegedly sat down with Declan and signed an agreement stating that the estate was officially considered shared family inheritance. The document explicitly stated that I fully acknowledged my role as a mere temporary caretaker of the property, and that I promised to vacate the premises the moment my older brother required the house for his own growing family. I stopped breathing. I stared at the bottom of the page. Right there, hovering above the dotted line, was my signature. Except, it was not my signature. The loops on the letters were slightly wrong. The pressure of the pen strokes was completely unnatural, heavy in places where my hand was usually light. But the most glaring, undeniable piece of evidence was the date written neatly next to the forged name. A massive, icy wave of adrenaline rushed through my veins, making my ears ring. I looked up at Harrison. I told him that on the exact date written on that paper, I was not even in the country. I had been on a 2-week corporate business trip in London. I had passport stamps, flight records, and hotel receipts to prove it. Declan and Valerie had forged my signature. They had sat down at their kitchen table, deliberately falsified a legal document, and formally submitted it to a court of law in an attempt to steal a multi-million-dollar estate. They had officially crossed the line. This was no longer just toxic family dynamics, emotional manipulation, or a frivolous civil suit. They had committed a blatant, undeniable, highly illegal felony. They had committed fraud and forgery. I sat back in the leather chair, my mind racing a million miles an hour. Harrison asked me to immediately pull up my banking app and forward him the specific credit card statements from that month in London, so we could definitively, legally prove my whereabouts and destroy this document entirely. I pulled my laptop out of my briefcase right there on Harrison's desk, connected to the office Wi-Fi network, and opened my internet browser to log into my bank account. But I had forgotten to close my social media tabs from the night before. Before I could navigate to the banking portal, the page refreshed and a new notification popped up on the corner of my screen. It was an email alert from a mutual friend, someone who had refused to take sides in the family war, containing a screenshot of a public Facebook post made by Valerie just an hour earlier. Against my better judgment, I clicked the image. In an instant, the blood in my veins completely boiled over. It was a high-definition, beautifully lit, professionally staged photograph of a brand new, completely customized designer nursery room in their apartment. Valerie was posing in the exact center of it, wearing a flowing white dress, holding her baby, and smiling brightly at the camera like she had just won the state lottery. I leaned closer to the screen and zoomed in on the photograph. I recognized the brands instantly because I had walked past those exact luxury boutiques in the wealthy part of the city. The wooden baby crib sitting against the wall was not a standard piece of furniture. It was a custom-built, imported mahogany crib that easily cost $1,500. The floor was covered in a massive, thick organic wool rug. The windows had custom velvet drapes. There was a high-end, motorized rocking chair and a hand-painted mural covering the entire back wall. It was a display of absolute, unadulterated, sickening wealth. The caption underneath the photo was the final nail in the coffin. It read, "So blessed to finally finish the nursery. Every little prince deserves a royal castle to grow up in. God is so good to us." I sat there in the quiet office, staring intently at the glowing screen, doing the mental math in my head. They had thousands of dollars to blow on useless luxury baby furniture. They had thousands more to pay a premium law firm's retainer fee, or at least, they were happy to let my parents drain their retirement to pay it. Yet, these were the exact same two people who had stood on my front porch, crying genuine tears, begging for my house because they were supposedly drowning in rent and could barely afford to buy diapers and groceries. The sheer, staggering hypocrisy of it all was blinding. It was physically repulsive. They were crying poverty to a civil judge, begging the internet for sympathy points, and calling me a greedy monster, all while living like absolute royalty on my parents' stolen retirement funds. That photograph was the definitive turning point in my life. Whatever lingering, microscopic shred of brotherly guilt I might have still harbored deep in my subconscious evaporated completely into the air. My anger shifted. It was no longer a hot, fiery rage. It became cold, calculated, and absolute. I closed the image. I looked up at Harrison, and I told him that the plan had changed. I no longer wanted to simply dismiss the civil lawsuit. I told him I wanted to go on the offensive. I shifted instantly from being a defensive victim trying to protect his house to becoming an active, predatory force. I wanted to completely, legally dismantle their entire lives. Harrison and I spent the next several days building an airtight, inescapable legal trap. The most important part of our strategy was silence. We did not call my brother. We did not alert the opposing counsel about our discovery of the forged document. We kept our mouths completely shut and happily let them continue to build their massive house of cards, completely unaware that the foundation was about to detonate. Instead of fighting them in the civil arena right away, Harrison quietly reached out to his vast network and hired an independent, highly credentialed forensic handwriting expert. We provided the expert with a fake document, along with dozens of verified, notarized samples of my real signature from my mortgage documents, work contracts, and tax returns. Within 48 hours, the expert handed us a beautifully bound, legally binding affidavit. The report confirmed, with absolute scientific certainty, that the signature on the family agreement submitted by Declan was a complete fabrication, likely traced and drawn slowly by someone attempting to mimic my handwriting. But having the forensic proof was not enough for me. I wanted absolute destruction. I wanted to weaponize the paper trail. While Harrison drafted the legal motions, I went to work on the social aspect of my revenge. I personally spent hours, late into the night, sitting at my computer in the dark, taking perfectly captured screenshots of every single lavish, expensive item Valerie had ever posted on her public social media accounts over the past 12 months. I documented everything. I took screenshots of their luxury weekend vacations, the designer handbags she constantly showed off, the expensive steak dinners they posted on their anniversaries, and, of course, multiple angles of the $1,500 nursery. I cross-referenced the dates of these posts with the timeline of their supposed financial ruin. I painstakingly organized every single image, every caption, and every hypocritical comment into a massive, heavily annotated digital dossier. I narrated this entire process to myself, finding it almost incredibly therapeutic. Every single time I hit the save button on a new piece of evidence, it felt like I was driving a heavy iron nail into the coffin of my brother's lifelong entitlement. I was methodically, quietly building a legal and social guillotine for my own flesh and blood. They had assumed I would just roll over and surrender because I was the quiet brother, the one who always kept the peace, the one who walked away to avoid a fight. They had entirely forgotten that the quiet brother was also the exact same man who possessed the intense discipline, patience, and sheer willpower to rebuild a massive, rotting mansion by hand over 5 long years. I knew exactly how to build a strong foundation from the ground up, and, because of that, I knew exactly which load-bearing walls to knock down to make their entire lives collapse. When the 5th week of this nightmare finally arrived, the trap was officially ready to be sprung. We did not just file a simple countersuit in civil court. Harrison and I took a much darker, much more permanent route. Early on a Tuesday morning, we walked directly into the downtown police precinct. We sat down with a detective specializing in white-collar crime, handed over the forensic handwriting analysis, the fake document they had submitted to the court, the proof of my location in London, and officially filed criminal complaints against both Declan and Valerie. The charges were felony fraud, perjury, and the forgery of a legal document. Because they had submitted the forged document to a judge in an active lawsuit, the police took it incredibly seriously. The heavy, crushing wheels of the criminal justice system began to turn, completely independent of the civil lawsuit. Declan and Valerie were no longer just fighting me. They were about to fight the state. Simultaneously, an hour later, Harrison filed a massive motion in civil court. He moved to dismiss their frivolous lawsuit with extreme prejudice, attaching the undeniable proof of their felony forgery. Furthermore, he filed a motion demanding that they, and the parents who had funded them, pay every single cent of my legal fees, plus punitive damages for malicious prosecution. But the legal maneuver was only half of my revenge. The social execution was the other half, and I wanted to deliver that blow myself. I went back to my corporate office, opened my email, and attached the massive digital dossier I had compiled over the past week. It contained the forensic proof of the fake signature, the bank records showing my parents draining their retirement to fund the attack, and a beautifully arranged, 30-page collage of Valerie's luxury purchases compared side by side with her pathetic, crying Facebook posts about being too poor to buy diapers. I drafted a single, perfectly polite, incredibly cold email. I outlined exactly what my brother and his wife had done. I explicitly stated that they were currently under active criminal investigation by the police for felony fraud and that they were facing potential prison time. I put Aunt Martha, my parents, every distant cousin, every family friend, and every single relative who had harassed me over the past month in the blind copy field of the email. I wanted them all to see the absolute truth at the exact same time. Without a single moment of hesitation, I clicked send. The aftermath was glorious. It was an instantaneous, deafening silence. There were no more angry text messages buzzing on my phone. There were no more self-righteous phone calls from distant cousins accusing me of being a monster. The entire toxic family network, which had been so unbelievably eager to burn me at the stake just a few weeks prior, completely and instantly collapsed under the crushing weight of undeniable, documented truth. Valerie immediately deleted her Facebook account, her Instagram, and her Twitter. The massive echo chamber of their lies had been completely shattered, leaving them exposed to everyone they knew. The very next evening, as I was cooking dinner in my quiet kitchen, my phone finally rang. It was not an angry relative apologizing. The caller ID flashed with my mother's name. I stared at the screen, feeling absolutely nothing, and let it go straight to voicemail. I waited a few minutes, poured myself a glass of water, and then listened to the recording. Margaret was completely frantic. Her voice was breaking with genuine, unmanufactured panic. She was weeping hysterically, the sound wet and desperate. She begged me, pleaded with me, to call Harrison immediately and drop the criminal charges. She sobbed that the police had shown up at Declan's apartment that afternoon to question them. She cried that Declan could actually go to state prison, that Valerie could potentially lose custody of her child to social services, and that this entire situation would completely, irreparably destroy the family forever. She begged me to remember that we shared the same blood, that he was my brother, and that I had to save him. I walked out of the kitchen, carrying my phone, and stepped out onto my newly refurbished front porch. I listened to her desperate pleas echo from the small speaker of my phone. I looked out over the 3 acres of land that belonged entirely to me. The sun was setting, casting a warm, beautiful golden glow over the green grass and the old oak trees. I did not call her back. I slowly pressed the delete button, erasing her voice from my phone and my life. I realized then that my mother was completely wrong. I was not the one destroying the family. The dark, poisonous rot had been there for decades. The intense greed, the unbelievable entitlement, the constant manipulation, the willingness to sacrifice one child for the comfort of another, it was all a massive, decaying root system deeply embedded in our family tree. I had spent my entire life watering a dead tree, hoping it would eventually bear fruit. But sometimes, the only way to cure a deep rot is to completely burn the roots and salt the earth so nothing toxic can ever grow there again. I sat back in my porch chair, took a deep, slow breath of the cool evening air, and felt an overwhelming, completely unapologetic sense of peace wash over my entire body. The war was officially over. The toxic elements had been purged. And my fortress, the home I had bled for, remained entirely mine. They called me a monster for sending my own brother to face criminal charges over a house, but after everything they put me through, am I the bad guy here? Should I drop the charges to save my parents from heartbreak, or let them face the consequences of their own greed? Let me know what you would do in the comments below. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this story and haven't subscribed yet, please hit that subscribe button, leave a like, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss out on our upcoming drama and revenge stories. See you in the next video.